What? It's not Wednesday. Hey, welcome to a bonus episode of the Retirement Answer Man Show. This is the show dedicated to helping you not just survive in retirement. Come on, who wants to just survive? We want you to rock retirement. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. So why are we having this special bonus edition? Well, let me tell you. Over the last 3 or 4 months, you may have noticed, you may not have, that we have monthly themes where we try to focus on a topic for a whole month to dive into it a little bit. But here's the problem to that segment is we get a chance to talk to some very special people. And sometimes those conversations come up and they don't really fit into the theme of the month. So what we're going to do going forward is when we have those opportunities, we're going to take them and we're just going to release a special bonus edition featuring the conversation that we have with these special people. And today we are going to have a chat with John Leland. He is a New York Times columnist, a New York Times bestseller, and he wrote the book, Happiness is a Choice You Make. And a great story. It started off as a series of columns in the New York Times about the experience of older people and his observations from spending time with these people. So right after this disclaimer, let's talk to John. And we'll have a link to the book in our show notes so you can learn from the wisdom that John had in walking life with people later in life. Hey, before we get to that talk with John, remember that this is all for helpful hints and education, and don't take advice from me on this show. Talk to the people that know you best and that are experts in that area before you make any decisions. Now, let's go have a talk with John Leland about how to make happiness a choice. Now, John Leland, as I mentioned, is a New York Times columnist for many years, a music fanatic, which I love music. You know, he hurt me a little bit because he's not a big fan of the 80s music. I think a quote, and I tease him about it off air, but he said the biggest achievement of 80s music was its disappearance. Oh, that hurt. That hurt my oingo boingo soul. But beyond that, he's a really cool guy with a very curious mind. And in his book, Happiness is a Choice You Make, he gets some amazing insights from spending time with people a lot older than us. So let's talk to John. So John, I guess, what was it like hanging out with really old people?
It was completely different from what I was expecting. I went into this project thinking it was going to be, I spent a year with 6 people over the age of 85, and I thought it was going to be sort of a dark year, chronicling their aches and pains and their falls and their arguments with their daughters, and et cetera. And it turned out to be an incredibly uplifting experience that I was not expecting at all.
When I got your book, and Nicole, our awesome sidekick, was the one that recommended it to me, I have a client who retires every 5 years. He's 52, and he's in one of those retirement 1.5 phases. He's taken his retirement through his life, he says. And he's been volunteering at a hospice, and he's finding the same thing. That these people
Nobody's happier than hospice workers. It's a crazy thing. You couldn't understand it except to say, well, you never lose a patient if you're a hospice worker. But seeing people that are really waking up in the morning with difficult problems and facing them rather than, whining and moaning about them, it does something to you. It just changes your attitude towards life.
And so in my end, I deal with people in their 50s and 60s. That's usually who I'm walking life with, and into the 70s. Even some of my clients in my 70s, they fear getting old. I mean, as old as the people that you talked about in your book, in the late 80s and then the 90s. They fear that. And it sounds like maybe they shouldn't.
I think a lot of us fear it, and we really do ourselves a disservice by fearing it. I read this definition of despair the other day as not being able to imagine a plausible, desirable future for yourself. And I think being afraid of old age does that to you. But if you flip it and think there are rewards for old age, you're not going to be able to play tennis like you used to, if you can play at all. But you're going to be a little bit wiser. You're going to be more patient. You're going to be less quick to judgment. You can forget about some of your grudges because it doesn't pay to hold on to them. And maybe the person you have the grudge against is no longer around. So there's a lot of compensations for it.
And so in your book, you walk with 6 people. You had Fred, Ping, John, Jonas, Ruth, and Helen, and her beau, Howie. And what I found interesting, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about each one of these, is you had one guy, John, who was like, I'll be happy when it's over, was sort of his attitude, which doesn't sound like a very happy guy as an elderly person. So, but you sort of say he was in a weird way. So tell me about John.
He's such an interesting case. John had lost his partner of 60 years, about 6 years before I met him. And he was losing his vision and he was losing the use of his hands. And he always thought when he got old, he would play piano and read. And now he couldn't do either of those things. And he missed his partner, Walter, enormously. So John, from the first time I met him, said he wanted to die. And John loved to talk. It just made him so happy. He would, even if it was talking about the same things that we talked about the last time I saw him, and even if it was talking about wanting to die. So one day I'm like, John, do you wish you died yesterday, or do you wish you were dead now? And he'd say, well, no, because we're having this conversation. I'd say, well, okay, I'm going to leave in a little while. Do you hope you die when I leave? And he'd say, well, no, because Anne, my niece, is coming over tomorrow, and then Alex the next day, and Marcus is on Wednesday, and Scott is coming later in the week, and he wanted to be around for those things. He just didn't want to have 30 years in front of him. And so I think that wanting to die, oddly enough, made John cherish each day more because he was going to put on his favorite opera, and this might be the last time he heard it. So he wasn't going to take that for granted and just sort of do the dishes while it was playing. He was going to really listen to it. And if I was visiting him, or Anne or Scott or Marcus, he was going to really pay attention to us. And I was with John on one of his last days in the nursing home because John finally was ready to go and he stopped eating. And so he was in a lot of pain and he's not eating and he's starving himself to death. And the physical therapist comes by and says, okay, John, I'll be back again tomorrow. And John says, I look forward to it already. And that's a kind of rich life for a guy who wants to die. I said, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow already. He's already taking that pleasure in it. And, people always tell us, live each day as if it's your last. John actually did it.
So I have a question, because as I was listening to that, it made me think that it was about interaction, that, he was looking forward to his nephew coming and to other people coming. And you wonder in those alone times if it's the absence of interaction that create depression. I mean, I guess there are studies on that. And that's the thing I think worry a lot of people, is that they become more and more lonely as they get older. And it sounds like with John, he was grumpy about it, but he had people that he always looked forward to talking to.
I think John had those two things. He had people coming in just often enough. I mean, often he would go days without talking to somebody. So it was maybe not as much as he would like. And he knew what he liked. He had old movies that he would watch again and again. And it didn't matter that he couldn't see the screen so much anymore. But as long as Hugh Grant was on that screen, he knew that he thought Hugh Grant was hot. And so that he would enjoy that. And he had enough of those things put together. He did exercises. He took care of himself. He fed himself. And he cobbled together his life. And the reason I call my book Happiness is a Choice You Make is that everybody figured out that happiness wasn't these external circumstances that happen for you. You can't wait till all your problems are fixed to be happy. Happiness is something you have to pick. It has to come from inside of you and be something that you have access to all the time.
Yeah, and it is a choice. I'm reading The Daily Stoic. That's one thing I'm doing this year. And I've never been exposed to Stoicism before. And a lot of it is, hey, your mind, that's your last possession, and you get to make choices, right?
Yeah.
I imagine as you get older, I know I'm 51, but even now I feel like I have better perspective to where I let things go and I have more control because I'm not dependent on other people to be happy. It's my choice.
Yeah, one thing that's really interesting is that as we get older, we're able to sustain mixed feelings. And mixed feelings means that there can be a situation in which there's like some loss and pain in it, but we're able to see the good in it. We're able to feel joyful even though something's perfect. Whereas when you're younger, you think, oh my God, it was okay, but then it sucked, right? We went to the beach, all our friends were there, everybody was there, but then, the crab cakes weren't as good as they should have been, and so it sucked,
Yeah, I have a 20 and 21-year-old, and I see my daughter, and it's that way, right? It's like, if I don't make this decision right, my life is ruined, is sort of the attitude. Whereas you get older, you realize, no, it's going to be fine. Everything will work out because you have more of your sea legs under you. And I guess when you're 70 or 80 or 90, you have a lot of perspective.
That's as long as you make that choice, it's your choice.
Now, what I liked was, so we had John, who had this sort of, he had obviously a very deep loss for Walter and was a little grumpy about it all, but he still chose and enjoyed life. And then you have these others, like you had Ping, who had almost nothing and seemed to focus on the beautifulness of life as she was an immigrant. So tell me a little bit about Ping and some of the lessons from her.
Ping was quite remarkable. She had raised 2 kids, and her son had been murdered in China. And she'd really lost sort of years of her life grieving for her son. But once she was past that, it was a corner turn in her life. She had worked a very, very difficult job in Chinatown and commuted on standing up on a crowded bus to get there. And at the end of the day, gone home and taken care of her husband or her daughter. And so for her, old age meant, a release from all those burdens of her younger years. And so she had more time on her hands. She had leisure, and she was able to find the sweet spot in the safety net. This is a financial show, I know. So she was able to get a subsidized apartment for about $200 and something a month, which in New York City is kind of unheard of.
Yeah.
And she had home attendants paid for by Medicaid for 7 hours a day. So she was really adequately taken care of. And she was able to live quite comfortably on $700 a month, which is what she got in SSI payments. And she played mahjong every day with the same 3 women. It kept her mind active. It kept her arms active because she had to move the pieces on the table. She was in community all the time. She had people that she shared life history with. They could talk about the good times in their life. And she said conversations are deeper now than they were when we were young. When we were young, we were always like, all we talked about was, are we going to be able to afford this or that? Or what do you want to watch on TV? And now we talk about the substance of life.
Yeah. And what's interesting with Ping, and I've seen it with clients, of being very content without a lot of material things. And some of it, I guess, is how you're brought up in learning how to be content without material things.
Yeah. Ping said, when you're old, you have to make yourself happy. Otherwise, you get older. And it's such a simple philosophy. It's like, yeah, you know what? That fur coat isn't really going to make you happy. You have to make yourself happy.
Yeah, I think, especially when you're younger, I don't know about you, but I know about me. I spent a lot of my youth in my 20s running around pursuing things, thinking that once I had that, I would be happy, right? You're searching because you're everywhere but yourself. You can spend a lot of money doing that.
You can spend a lot of money. You can spend a lot of time. I think even more importantly, I have to get that promotion because my life's not going to be meaningful if I don't get that promotion. And you know what I'll do? I'll work weekends and long nights. And you get to middle age or late age and you say, well, that wasn't really that meaningful to me. What's meaningful to me is my relationship with my son or my relationship with my daughter or with my friends. And those are all the things I sacrificed for that time I spent pursuing that job.
Yeah. And a lot of times you try to recapture that when you're not pursuing those career goals. And that's when you have adult kids that don't have as much time for you, right?
Exactly.
It's like the Cat Stevens song, father and son. Now, contrast that with Fred, because Fred, here's how I interpreted Fred. One, I think you mentioned he was a financial saver. He was a good steward from a financial sense. And it also sounded like he was a bit of a player.
Fred was a total player. Fred had 6 children by 4 different women. And he said, I played and played and played, and I got played out. Now I'm alone. I have nobody to take care of me. But Fred was the one that really turned me on to this. Fred was the one who chose happiness more than anybody because he was, when I met him, he had this infection in 2 toes that was going to turn gangrenous, and he was going to have to lose parts of those 2 toes. He lived in a walk-up apartment, so he had to climb 2 flights of stairs. And doing that.
And how old was he? Remind me how old he was.
He was 87 when I met him.
Okay.
But Fred said to me one day, he goes, what's your definition of happiness? And I would say, well, it's having a purpose and doing things you care. And he goes, no, that's not happiness. That's wrong. Happiness is what's happening right now. Happiness isn't when you get to the dance. It's not that new fur, when you get that new fur coat. If you're not happy now, you're not happy. Now, it's such a profound thing, but Fred lived it.
Yeah, and I always wonder, because there was a quote from Fred of he never knew what it was like to be in love, like truly in love, all-encompassing love. And when you read that, the knee-jerk reaction is how sad that is. But did it seem, when he said it, was it sad?
I think that Fred had some regret there that he never found a bond with a partner the way he did with his brother and his mother, who, remained the closest people in his life. I mean, his mother was dead by the time I met him, but she had been, and that had been genuine love and somebody he really cared about more than he would care about himself. And he never found that with a woman, and he would get tired of women after a little while, and he'd always think there was something better out there for him. And I think that was a regret for him. Fred also died in 2016.
Now, you talk about happiness as a choice you make. And then you started off talking about Fred. Oh, yeah, he had gangrene on a couple of his toes and everything else. I'm like, okay, well, it's easy to choose not to be happy in that situation. Yet he did.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it. And it all began with a sense of gratitude. Like the way Fred looked at the world was that he wasn't getting these problems he was going through weren't a case of him being cheated. The world wasn't working against him. It wasn't like he didn't need to triumph over the world. The world was this place that gave him all these great things that he didn't have to do anything to bring about. Like he didn't have to invent sex. It was just already there for him, and it could give him such pleasure. He didn't have to invent Pringles, which was part of Fred's downfall.
Pringles.
They were just there. Imagine living in a world where there's sex and Pringles, and like, what more can you ask? Okay, so you have a little gangrene and it's hard to walk up the steps.
But I got Pringles.
You can choose one, or you can choose the other. You can be like, I'm a guy who gets sex and Pringles.
Now, Jonas, who was very different because it was like he mentally embraced being young. I think his quote was, "I worked all my life to become young. No, you can't persuade me to get old. I will die 27." That was a poem he wrote, right?
Yeah. Jonas, fascinating case. His name is Jonas Mekas. He's one of the pioneers of American avant-garde filmmaking, and the only person in my group who's not just a regular lunch pail carrying guy. He would have been friends with Andy Warhol and John Lennon and Yoko Ono, so he led a little fancier life than a lot of us do, and he was filled with such wisdom all the time. And one of the things that he told me was not to worry about things, and it's been a huge help. He says, I never worry. Why worry when something's not happening? And then when it happens, why worry then? You deal with it. You waste all this time worrying about things that haven't happened. And he says, nothing is hopeless. I don't even know what it means, hopeless. And I rely on that line, I think probably once a week. Don't worry. Don't treat the things that haven't happened as if they'd happened. And I know so many people that are living as if the disaster that looks like it might happen has already happened.
That is so true, especially, I see that in people trying to decide whether to leave full-time work, right? Because there's plenty to worry about. There's a worry about health insurance. There's worries about the markets, about interest rates. Will I run out of money? And it can truly just rob your entire life.
Yeah, people worry about their spouse is going to fall out of love with them, and so they do everything to make that happen. You worry that, yes, you're going to run out of money, we're going to be in a war with this country or that country. Maybe all those things will happen, but why live as if they're happening now? You prepare for them to the extent that you can, but people pull their hair out over things that haven't happened.
Or let's go back to Fred for a second. You can worry about the gangrene on your toe, or you can deal with it and go eat some Pringles and have some sex, right?
Well, the Pringles didn't do Fred any good. But, but it was, he did make a mess of his life in some ways, but it was his mess, and he accepted that.
So tell me some of the broader lessons that you culled from these very different individuals. What I loved is each one of them, we didn't cover all 6, approached life and had a philosophy that were very different in a lot of ways. But what were some commonalities that you brought together in your book?
I think the big one, and it's sort of where the title of the book, Happiness is a Choice You Make, comes from, is that whatever age we are, whatever problems we have in life, because we always have problems whatever age we are, we have a say over what role we give them, those problems in our lives. We can define ourselves by our hardships or our setbacks, or we can define ourselves by all the things that we can still do. One of the things I say in the book is you can go to a museum and say, I'm, confined to a wheelchair with a group of half-deaf old people, or you can just say, Michelangelo. And it's the difference between a miserable life and a happy life, even though to an outsider it looks like the same life.
And it's your choice, and it's a muscle you have to exercise, I'd imagine.
Mm-hmm. And there's people that can't. I understand that. Depression is a serious thing. It's an illness, and it requires professional treatment, and nothing in this book is meant to be a remedy for that. And there's people that have had grievous losses that aren't going to be changed by a change in attitude. But for most of us, we can move that needle a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left. And maybe when we do that, we can move it a little bit more. I know I've gone from being kind of an Eeyore type Grinch to an annoyingly upbeat person. I'm driving my friends crazy. Being in New York, being upbeat is
yeah, that's very counterculture.
It's like dressing like Peter Pan,
Yeah, and I've had a similar journey in that. And there was some tapes wow, this is 20 years ago now. I think the guy's name was Aaron Helmsley. And it was like on quitting smoking, which is odd because I never smoked. But it's one of those things when you're trying to make these changes. I wonder if yours was this way. You sort of have to say, okay, in the next hour, I'm going to look at the bright side of things. And then once you get through the hour, now it's in the next hour, you have to take it in incremental things of changing that attitude.
I don't think I was quite as deliberate about it. I noticed it in retrospect. I noticed, hey, I'm not bugged about these things anymore. At first, I wondered, my mother's fairly depressive, and my mother's got a very comfortable life. She lives in a lovely building. She's one of those people from that World War II generation that saved every penny she made, so she's comfortable financially now. And I was going to see her after seeing Fred one time. I'm like, well, Fred is losing 2 toes and is in this walk-up apartment that he can't clean, and his daughter's dying of breast cancer, and she can't come over and help him anymore, and it stinks in there. Fred is so happy and enjoying his life, and I go to my mother's, and she's, very well cared for, and she's depressed. And I just thought, well, how can she be like that? And then I started to think, well, I'm not appreciating my life either, and I'm going to start doing that. And I just started to follow Fred by just giving thanks for things, just being more grateful, including being more grateful for the time I spend with my mother.
Happiness is a choice you can make. Great book. We'll have links to it in the show, and I'm happy that you shared some of these stories. Thank you, John.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Hey, thanks for joining me on this special bonus episode. If you want to check out John's book, go to rogerwhitney.com into the show notes for this show, and we'll have links so you can find it either online at our store near you. Until next week, be well.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.